This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Hi everyone, it's Nace and welcome back to Draw Curiosity. I'm sure you've noticed the coronavirus news over the past couple of months, unless you've been living under a rock. And as I record this, it hasn't officially been declared a pandemic, but I do think it is on the brink of being declared one. So chances are by the time this video is live, it might already be one. But anyway, I did want to make a video covering what we know about this novel coronavirus and how we know what we know about it. If you found this channel through this video, first of all, welcome to Draw Curiosity. Secondly, as for my credentials, I did my degree in biological sciences and I hold a PhD in biomechanics. So I'm not the kind of doctor who will save your life, but I am a doctor who can read scientific papers on microbiology and epidemiology and will gladly explain them to you in sickness and in health. And finally, although there are other aspects of epidemiology probably applied to this novel coronavirus that I am planning to cover on this channel, normally I cover obscure bits of science that I personally find interesting and think others will too. So if that's your jam, welcome to Draw Curiosity, and if it's not, that's fine too. I hope this video is helpful. Also, as you might be able to see, this video is jam-packed with information, as you can probably guess from the length, so obviously I would encourage you to watch the whole thing because I've put plenty of effort and care into packaging it together quite nicely, but there is an index of questions and segments on screen and in the description and in the pinned comment with all of the time codes. So if you want to choose to focus on certain aspects or you just want to have an idea of what to expect from this video, you can navigate around it quite easily. And I have also linked primary literature that I've read to prepare for this video, as well as a few other helpful sites and other resources on YouTube, which I personally have found to be quite reliable and evidence-based should you want further reading and viewing material. So without further ado, what and how do we know about the novel coronavirus? Where did the virus come from? The epicenter for COVID-19 was in Wuhan, China, and it most likely originated through zoonosis, which is when a virus, bacteria, or other organism that usually lives in a non-human animal species spreads and causes disease in a human. The running hypothesis is that it was likely a coronavirus that was present in a bat. The bat then transmitted this virus in its feces or through a separate mechanism to a currently unknown intermediate host, which was then brought possibly to the Huanan seafood market, where it was transmitted to humans. Bats are actually reservoirs and carriers for many viruses. They actually make really good host organisms for these viruses because firstly, they roost in very large groups and they're in very close contact with each other, but they also have relatively long lifespans. Not only that, but bats have a higher body temperature due to their metabolism, and they also have specially adapted immune systems that enable them to fight off infections much more easily. So they are actually generally unaffected by these viruses that they carry, but it does make them really good carriers for these viruses. The novel coronavirus was found to share a 96.2% match with another coronavirus carried by the horseshoe bat, so that is probably the original carrier. The intermediate host is unclear to date. Scientists have conducted genetic tests and they found matches that point towards snakes, pangolins, maybe civets, but none of it is particularly conclusive, and to date, to my knowledge, the novel coronavirus has not been found in any intermediate host animal, so we don't really know for sure. That being said, although around 40 to 50 cases at least are thought to be of zoonotic origin from the Huanan wet market, right now, the primary source of transmission is actually human-to-human transmission. Does the origin matter then? Whilst I would say it is not the primary source of infection, I personally think it would be good to know because firstly, it provides further clues on how to maybe approach finding a cure or better treatment for COVID-19, how to control the virus, and most importantly, knowing what animal is likely to become the reservoir for this disease so as to prevent future outbreaks from actually recurring from a zoonotic source if we actually manage to contain the virus. So how are you sure this isn't a bioweapon? And isn't it just very convenient all of this happened when it did? Now, I've had lots of people come forward to me with different conspiracy theories, such as whether this novel coronavirus was designed as a bioweapon, to a form of ethnic cleansing, to a leak from a containment lab in Wuhan. In all honesty, I don't think that is the case. At least, I wouldn't say there's any evidence to date that would suggest it's the case. And the sources of these hypotheses are people who are merely speculating and there's no concrete line of evidence. So if it does turn out to be one of those, it isn't linked to any evidence that's been put out so far. That being said, I think it's unlikely, and I'm pretty sure it is just an unfortunate case of zoonosis for several reasons. Firstly, if this were a bioweapon released maliciously, I think it would be a lot deadlier, full stop. Secondly, if it were an accidental leak from a lab, the epicentre would probably not be a wet market, but maybe people working or people connected to people working at that containment lab. Now, although the first case wasn't at the wet market, the vast majority of early cases were either workers at the Huanan seafood market, people who had been to that market, or people who were in close contact with people at that market. So I think it probably started from an intermediate host that ended up in that market. Wuhan is the 39th most populated city in the world, just behind New York, and many large cities also have research centres that work with pathogens. So I'd say it's not even coincidence that there happens to be such a lab somewhere in the same city. It's practically unsurprising, and the fact that the two are connected, I don't think means it's been released maliciously. Finally, it's definitely not a racially targeted virus. I'll talk more about that when we reach the demographics part of this video, but we now have epicentres in different parts of the world. I think it's evident that everyone is equally affected by the virus regardless of race. However, it should be said that although the Huanan seafood market is thought to likely be the epicentre of the coronavirus, actually the very first patient presenting with COVID-19 symptoms and 13 other people from those early 40-50 cases, they actually had no direct connection to the Huanan seafood market. Nonetheless, they may have contracted it from an intermediate host before that intermediate host reached the Huanan seafood market, or it may have been an early case of human-to-human transmission, and it could just be that they simply became symptomatic a little bit earlier. Either way, I would say that wet markets are the perfect breeding grounds for zoonotic diseases to emerge because you're putting lots of different animals together. It definitely isn't the first time this has happened. MERS, SARS, plenty of other flus. And at least one good thing is, as of last Monday, China has permanently banned wildlife trade, and it's a permanent ban as opposed to the original suspension. So at least that's good, and hopefully will prevent similar events from happening in the future. How does the novel coronavirus infect humans? You might have rightfully been wondering how come bats and other animals are carriers of many viruses but may be unaffected by them, and how come we aren't affected by all of the viruses that affect and are carried by other organisms. And the reason for this, in honestly very simple terms, is that viruses, compared to bacteria and other parasites, are extremely small and quite far from being self-sufficient. In fact, I would argue they're not even alive. Unlike bacteria, which can replicate by themselves, viruses rely on hijacking the cellular machinery of other self-sufficient organisms in order to get them to replicate their viral particles for them. However, hijacking cells isn't a straightforward process, and viruses actually require very specific surface proteins to do that job, which makes them highly specialized at breaking and entering very specific cells from very specific organisms. So, for example, the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which can cause AIDS, has its entry point on the CD4 receptor and either the CCR5 or CXCR4 co-receptor on CD4 T lymphocytes, which is a very specific type of white cell. In the case of this novel coronavirus, it has the same entry point as the SARS coronavirus from 2003, which are the ACE2 or ACE2 receptors in the lungs. It also shares 79.5% of its genetic material with the SARS coronavirus, but it does affect humans quite differently. In human-to-human transmission, the virus actually begins to shed before the person carrying it is symptomatic, which, as you know, is quite problematic for containing the virus, and unfortunately, it also spreads primarily through droplets and aerosolization from coughs and sneezes. That being said, viral particles have also been found in feces. Even if the droplets or aerosolized particles aren't breathed in by someone, the coronavirus is also capable of surviving or remaining active on surfaces for a period of time. So if you touch a surface with your hands, even though it won't be able to penetrate through your skin, if you then touch your eyes or your mouth or your mucosa, you can actually contract the coronavirus that way. Who is affected by the coronavirus? Based on 72,314 cases of COVID-19 recorded in China, Current to the 11th of February, the main risk factor for having a more severe course of COVID-19 is increasing age, and 86.6% of those cases were in 30 to 79-year-olds. Fortunately, it does seem that children are mostly spared, with much fewer cases and, at least according to the study, with no fatalities recorded amongst those under the age of 10. From 10 to 30 years, the number of deaths per number of cases, or death rate, is 0.2%. And from then on, the death rate begins to increase, with the highest death rate being amongst those who are 80 plus years old, who actually have a nearly 15% death rate. Interestingly, the death rate in men in this study is actually higher than in women, 2.8% versus 1.7%. However, it must also be noted that this study is based in China, and smoking is highly prevalent amongst older Chinese males, who form the bulk of the age group of the fatalities. Therefore, I personally would say it's currently inconclusive whether the difference in death rate is due to sex, or whether it's just due to the fact that Chinese males who are older are more likely to smoke, and that predisposes you to having more lung damage already before being hit by the illness. Likewise, the death rate also increased with the presence of pre-existing conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, hypertension, and cancer. All of these figures that are shown on screen they indicate the risk of dying if infected by COVID-19, if you have said pre-existing condition. I would say this is also tied in with increasing age, because elderly people are more likely to have developed comorbidities that can potentially lead to complications. There has also been some speculation as to whether the virus was particularly virulent in Asian people. This was actually due to a paper that looked at the proportion of ACE2 receptors in lung tissue from only 7 patients, and one of those was an Asian male, and it was found that this patient had a higher proportion of these receptors. Therefore, it was speculated that perhaps Asian people might be more susceptible to having a more severe course of COVID-19 due to having more potential entry points in their lungs. However, the study is actually inconclusive because there weren't many data points at all, and the subsequent study that looked at lung tissue from lung cancer patients showed that ACE2 receptors were more prevalent in the lungs of people who were chronic smokers. That being said, that paper has problems too because it's only from people with lung cancer. But as said earlier, old Chinese men tend to smoke more, so it may have been a confounding variable if ACE2 is more related to smoking than ethnicity. And that being said, there have been more recent outbreaks, unfortunately, in Iran and Italy, as well as cases across all non-Antarctic continents. So I personally think it's clear that race isn't really a factor in being more or less susceptible to COVID-19. Is the death rate accurate? Technically speaking, the fatality rate cannot be accurately calculated until the epidemic has fully run its course. It's not fully accurate to count cases that haven't been resolved, as it takes around 3 weeks for a patient to unfortunately pass away from complications of COVID-19, and a similar amount, if not even longer, to be fully recovered from COVID-19 and to cease from being infectious. So this may lead to the temptation of only using recovered versus fatalities to compute this statistic, but that would actually lead to overinflating the fatality before the epidemic is over, as the patients that eventually recover will take longer to do so. Of course, doing so with the full number of current cases is also inaccurate, but knowing that 80% of cases are mild, it may also be possible to predict that most patients with a good prognosis or not in critical condition are more likely to recover. Additionally, as for deaths in recovered cases that may go unreported, it is likely there are both, but the latter is likely larger than the former, which if anything means the fatality rate is probably going to be lower. It's also worth noting that the death rate is also going to be affected by the quality of healthcare that can be received. Worldometers indicates that 18% of cases are serious or critical, which means they required hospitalization and possibly support through ventilators to manage ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, or other complications resulting from pneumonia. Unfortunately, and despite good healthcare, some cases will still result in death, but in other cases, that support could save a life. In regions where such support is unavailable, a higher proportion of critical cases will likely be fatal. And likewise, if the epidemic causes many concurrent cases in a single region, those resources won't be available for everybody at the same time, which will also increase the death rate. In fact, the death rate in Wuhan is higher than in other areas of China due to the larger volume of cases and hospitalizations. Likewise, the outbreak in Iran, although I'm not certain the numbers are fully accurate, the death rate does appear to be quite a bit higher than expected. I guess it's possible the virus might have mutated and become more virulent, that is, it's become more harmful as a disease. I actually doubt that is the case. I actually think it's more likely the healthcare system is being challenged. So in case you don't know, Iran has been hit quite hard by US sanctions, which actually limits Iran's ability to purchase medical equipment and medicine from the US. So as such, although Iran's healthcare system is by no means unadvanced, it does have shortages on certain medical equipment, and it does have to produce most of its medicines locally. So I don't actually know if Iran was prepared for the unique healthcare challenges that this novel coronavirus presents. Likewise, in countries where the healthcare system has insufficient resources, I worry that cases of ARDS that may be salvageable with appropriate resources would end up in fatality. And appropriate containment methods might not be available either, so the disease might spread further and overwhelm people with cases. Additionally, I worry that people might delay or avoid seeking treatment in countries where healthcare is expensive, such as, for instance, the US, and that again might lead to further spread and for more serious symptoms to become critical or deadly due to the delay in treating them. How does the novel coronavirus cause disease and kill? How do we treat it? The novel coronavirus is not fatal in most cases. The vast majority of cases are mild, only with minor respiratory symptoms. A smaller subset of people will develop non-life-threatening pneumonia. The lesions shown are atypical and different to pneumonia caused from other diseases, including SARS. However, there is a small percentage of people who will actually go on to develop ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. On average, shortness of breath appears around 5 days after the onset of illness, and then ARDS, if it occurs on average around 8 days after the onset of symptoms. ARDS is often diagnosed by hypoxemia or low oxygen levels in blood, rapid onset of shortness of breath, and a chest scan showing infiltrates in the lungs. These infiltrates are caused by fluid present in the alveoli, which impede the oxygen from entering the bloodstream appropriately. Currently, there's no cure for the coronavirus, and there's actually no cure for ARDS, other than palliative care, although it must be said that substantial advances in its treatment have been made over the past 20 years, which make ARDS much less of a death sentence than it used to be. There are several different strategies that are used, especially when the hypoxemia actually persists. Firstly, the patient is generally connected to oxygen. Where possible, mechanical ventilation is actually avoided, as the motion of the air entering and exiting the alveoli will cause shear stress on the alveoli. This can make them shut down and can actually make the situation worse. So instead, positive end expiratory pressure, or PEEP, is used with a very high percentage of oxygen, with the objective of increasing the oxygen saturation that is passed into the blood through the alveoli. Secondly, patients with ARDS are also often placed in a prone position, that is, lying on their fronts, and this also helps to increase oxygenation as well. Sedatives and medications that prevent movement are generally used as well, because ventilation support can actually be quite painful for the patient, and that can lead to agitation, which can also affect and encumber treatment. And then diuretics are also used to encourage the body to remove the fluids, and that can help reduce the buildup in the lungs. But this also requires very careful management, because if it's done improperly, it will actually affect and lower the blood pressure and can also damage the kidneys. There are also ECMO, which stands for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, where blood is taken from the body and pumped through a membrane that adds oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. In essence, it basically carries out the job of the lung for you. These strategies all help increase oxygenation, but if the lung damage is extensive, the hypoxemia may not be relieved, and therefore the body can still be subjected to hypoxic damage. It's also worth noting that the last two treatments, especially ECMO, require a lot of management and attention, so they would likely not be feasible to carry out safely if there's a large volume of patients for a lower volume of nurses. And even access to oxygen and ventilators may not necessarily be guaranteed if there are many critical cases happening at once within one hospital. Although the novel coronavirus mainly affects the lungs, it can also cause damage to other organs. There have been reports of people having gastrointestinal problems such as nausea and diarrhea, and virus particles have then been found in their stools. The coronavirus can also affect the heart and blood vessels. Some patients have been reported to have irregular or atypical heartbeats and a lower than normal blood pressure. Liver and kidney damage has also been observed in COVID-19 patients. That being said, I think it's inconclusive whether liver damage is a consequence of drugs that might have been used to treat the patient with the disease, or if it might be a consequence of the coronavirus. Likewise, some people had kidney damage, some even requiring a kidney transplant. However, again, this could be a knock-on effect of continued hypoxemia. It might be due to improper fluid management if they took diuretics, and it might not necessarily be a direct consequence of the virus. Finally, some people have experienced sepsis or a cytokine storm, which is essentially an overreaction from the immune system, and it actually ends up causing further damage and build-up in the lungs. It can make ARDS even more severe and unmanageable, and it also makes the lungs more susceptible to secondary infection, because other opportunistic bacteria and viruses can also infect the patient and cause further complications. Although the pneumonia is atypical, the instances of liver damage and kidney damage and also overactive immune responses such as the cytokine storm have been documented in previous cases of SARS and MERS during their respective coronavirus outbreaks. How long will it take for there to be a cure? I don't know. I know different antiretrovirals have been tried and some claim that some might be somewhat effective, but to my knowledge, nothing that I have read to date indicates that there is a drug specific to this coronavirus that halts its infection or transmission. Therefore, the cure available is the one that's actually developed by your body's immune system, given enough time. I would say at this point, healthcare is more palliative, that is, it affords relief and ideally buys time for the patient's immune system to kick in. Hopefully, curative treatment will be available in the future, but to my knowledge, there is nothing to date. Why do vaccines take so long? I don't know how long it will take for a cure to be developed, but it is known that a vaccine would, at the very least, take 18 months to be developed. And even then, I think that might be an overly optimistic and early date, because it would rely on the vaccine being developed and passing all trials early and quickly. Usually, vaccines take around 2 to 5 years to make, and there are also many diseases such as dengue, Chagas, malaria, amongst many other neglected tropical diseases that claim many lives every single year, and they still don't have reliable vaccines available, and it's not due to lack of research necessarily. The truth, plain and simple, is that vaccine development is tricky. You want to develop something that is safe. Firstly, it has to be specific enough to the novel coronavirus, such that the antibodies and immune response that the body prepares in response to the vaccine will be effective against the virus, and not anything more or less specific than that coronavirus. And also for said response to not be an over-response when exposed to the vaccine or the virus, because that would also be dangerous. This process takes time, as testing vaccine safety requires several rounds of trials before reaching humans and before initiating any vaccination campaigns. There is research on the SARS virus available, and some of it will definitely be useful for developing a vaccine for the novel coronavirus. However, it will still entail developing a new vaccine and ensuring that it passes through all the different trials safely. So almost for sure, the first sweep of this epidemic will pass through entirely susceptible people. And all of this is not even taking into consideration the fact that the virus could mutate and it could develop new strains. And that, of course, is an additional headache for vaccine development. Speaking of which, it's probably a good time to remind you to have your flu shot if you haven't already. Flu season this year, I know, has been pretty bad, and the flu is known to mutate every year. I will say I've seen some research that suggests they think the genetics of this novel coronavirus is relatively stable, so hopefully we won't be facing a virus that mutates too often. What are the symptoms of COVID-19? Firstly, it's worth noting and reminding that the novel coronavirus is known to be asymptomatic anywhere up to around 2 weeks after contracting it, with a few exceptional outliers taking closer to 3 to 3.5 weeks, but it is still infectious during this period. When it goes on to cause disease, the most common symptom is fever. Studies on symptoms that have been displayed by people who ended up being hospitalized for treatment and people who tested positive for COVID-19 show that 83 to 98.5% had a fever, 60 to 80% have a dry cough, and 20-30% will get shortness of breath. Of course, many illnesses can cause very similar symptoms, but given what we know, should you present these symptoms, or you might suspect that you could have it, I would recommend firstly self-isolating, and then secondly getting in touch over the phone with your healthcare clinic to be safe and to avoid passing anything on to other people, whether it be COVID-19 or anything else that you may have. How can I protect myself and others? Firstly, it's good to be alert and aware, which I guess you already are if you decided to watch this video and find information online, but also not overly panicky either. Anxiety is just going to make your immune system worse and it's not going to prepare you any better. The answer to this, though, depends on where you live. If you're in the full swing of an epidemic, it's probably worth listening to your government because they ought to have specific recommendations both to your situation and your location, such as how to do self-isolation, how to quarantine, what to do with regards to healthcare. If you're in an area that has no or relatively few cases, then it's worth staying alert so as to be prepared should anything actually occur or change. But no need to panic either. Firstly, earlier I mentioned the virus, like many other viruses, can survive on surfaces that can be touched. Therefore, washing hands often and properly with soap and water will help to keep them clean. Most importantly, I would avoid touching your face because this will prevent any virus particles from transferring into your mucosa. Wearing gloves, if you can, especially if you're out in public, sitting in public transport, can also serve as a deterrent from actually putting your hands to your face. It will help to remind you to not do that. Likewise, disinfecting surfaces in your home will also prevent viruses from surviving in your home and then picking them up later. Make sure you wash food well, avoid any cross-contamination. If you are going to cough or sneeze, do so into a tissue, immediately wrap it up and throw it away. If you can, wrap up that tissue in another one. I think it's catch it, wrap it, throw it. And then obviously wash your hands immediately. If you can't, then cough and sneeze into your elbow. It will prevent droplets from going out into the air. Plus, it won't be on your hands, so you are less likely to then touch and spread it onto other surfaces. Face masks can offer protection from liquid droplets, and depending on the type you're using, and if you're using them correctly, they can also protect from smaller aerosol particles. They don't protect the eyes though, and they aren't foolproof. Airports, public transport and hospitals are the three places I would definitely recommend wearing face masks and gloves and being as protective as possible. If you are sick, please wear a face mask too. Finally, hopefully it doesn't need saying, but I think it's always worthy of reminding, please don't take antibiotics. Antibiotics only work by breaking down the cell walls of certain bacteria. Viruses, as said earlier, are way smaller than bacteria and they don't have cell walls or structures remotely similar to bacteria. So antibiotics are completely ineffective against them. The only instance where you might be asked to take antibiotics is when they're administered by doctors to hospitalized patients who may be at risk from suffering secondary infection. Otherwise, you don't need to take them. You're just creating resistant bacteria. If you suspect you may have the coronavirus or you've been somewhere in the last 2 to 3 weeks where there was a risk of contracting it, then I would recommend and almost urge you to stay at home, self-isolate and phone into your healthcare provider. Avoid walking into a clinic, as if you are carrying it, you could spread it onto others who might already be ill, and you can also increase your own chance of contracting something. So first, find out what their advice is over the phone. Your doctor or nurse should give you the best advice on how to protect yourself and to protect yourself from others, regardless of whether you're staying at home or need to go into the clinic, because they might have a procedure for how you go to get tested or get hospitalized, depending on what you need. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. I promise the next one will be a little bit cheerier. And after that, there will be a part 2 coming soon talking all about epidemiology and how scientists can build models to make predictions about how diseases will or won't spread throughout a population. Because, you know me, I enjoy my interdisciplinary sciences and how they influence each other. Which, incidentally, if you want a head start on this new video, feel free to head over to today's sponsor, which is Brilliant. Brilliant is a problem-solving website which helps you delve into the world of math and science by doing as well as by watching. They teach things across different modules, machine learning, mathematics, geometry, and you can then do different exercises to test your understanding and put it into practice. This upcoming epidemiology video may or may not have required me to brush up on my differential equations, of which Brilliant very conveniently has a module on. So if you need to do revision for college, you just want a head start on my next video, or you want to learn new skills in maths and science for the personal joy of it as I did, Feel free to head over to brilliant.org/jourcuriosity. The first 200 people who sign up over there will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. I think they're doing a great thing over there. It's a fantastic resource. It's very well put together. I've been using it and learning a lot from it, and also they're supporting Your Curiosity. So if this would be helpful to you in any way, please go ahead and grab that discount. And as always, thank you so much to all of my wonderful Patreons on Patreon. And as always, thank you so much for watching me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. And stay healthy.